The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Brain Injury Association of New York State's webinar training, Understanding Life with Brain Injury. I'm Bridget Aliaga, Brain Injury Training and Services Program Coordinator here at the Association. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. Because of limited time, we ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. During the Q&A session, questions can be submitted via the question text box. The question text box option should be visible to you on the GoToWebinar toolbar in your desktop. If you're having trouble viewing this option, please contact Psychiatric support at 800-263-6317. Again, that number is 800-263-6317. This number should also be visible to you on your toolbar. Our speaker will do her best to answer questions in the order that they are received. Any questions she is unable to address may be submitted via email to the Association. Training materials will be emailed to attendees within the next week. Certificates of attendance will also be sent to participants who complete the webinar exit survey. This survey will be displayed once this webinar session has concluded. We will be recording this webinar session and plan to post it along with presentation slides and training materials to our website, www.bianys.org. Information about contacting the association and viewing the webinar will be provided in a follow-up email after the presentation has ended. My contact information will also be included in those follow-up messages. Before I turn the microphone over to Judy, let us begin with a quick poll to see who is in our audience today. Please take a moment to answer the question. Okay, I'm about to launch the poll. So everyone just take a moment to answer that. I'll give you about 10 seconds. Have another 5 seconds before I close the poll. All right, looks like most of you are almost finished, so I'll give you another second or two. All right, I'm closing the poll now, and I'm going to share the results. And it looks like most of you are a healthcare professional or caseworker. It's about 45% of you. 9% are a professional in a school setting. 3% are an individual with a brain injury or a family member. 37% are affiliated with a brain injury program. And the other 7 of you are in the other category. So let's close that. As an organizer, it is truly a privilege to be part of the planning process, and today we do have an especially large crowd. So I want to thank you all for your participation in helping to spread the word about our monthly webinars. It is with sincere pleasure that I introduce the Brain Injury Association of New York State's Executive Director and our webinar presenter for the day, Judith Abner. Judy, good morning.
Good morning, Bridget, and everybody on the webinar. So thank you all for joining us this morning for this webinar presentation about understanding life with brain injury. And as we go through this, I will be clear to explain what this training is about and what you can expect to see and what the materials that you will be receiving after the webinar is over, so that you'll know what you have to look forward to. But without further ado, I'd like to get started. I will try to make this very interesting because 2 hours is a long time to be sitting at your computer staring at slides. But it's very important information, and we're really, really glad that you have chosen to take the time out of your schedules to participate. So let's start first with, well, just a very quick sense of some of the numbers. We talk about brain injury still as a silent epidemic, that the latest numbers indicate, as is said on the slide, that just over 3 million Americans live with a brain injury, and that about brain injuries occur at the rate of 3 every minute. So that's a pretty significant number when you multiply that out. We will not be spending a lot of time talking about statistics, but it is important nonetheless to put this in some kind of context. I apologize. Okay, let me, okay, so sorry about that. The technical technical difficulties, but I think I have it mastered now. Okay, so what is the genesis? What's the origin of this Understanding Life with Brain Injury training that you're participating in today? Several years ago, the Brain Injury Association of New York State was approached and contracted with the State Health Department to do a quality assurance study, to really interview individuals who are participating in New York State's Medicaid waiver for individuals with brain injuries, to try to assess the level of satisfaction that people experience with the services they were receiving under the waiver. And the conclusion was that overall the vast majority of individuals surveyed were satisfied with the services that they received. So of course this suggests that providers of services under the waiver are doing a good job. However, the individuals surveyed, and this includes the people who were satisfied with their services as well as the people who had some dissatisfaction with their services, indicated that they wished that the providers of their services first had more information and understanding of what living with a brain injury was like, and second, that the staff were more familiar with working with individuals with brain injuries. What the waiver participants in the study had indicated to us was that they often felt that they or their family members were the teachers in the first instance about brain injury and about supporting individuals with brain injuries before they could even get to the provision of services. And they really were quite clear that that was not their expectation nor a role that they wanted to play. Their expectation was that those providing the services would have some base knowledge about brain injury, about the population with whom they were working, and about strategies and about understanding about what life with brain injury was like, that this was something different. It was not just a generic set of services or a generic injury, but something very specific. And their expectation was that those staff, particularly those providing home and community support staff, were knowledgeable about brain injury. So the next step was to develop this training program that we've called Understanding Life with Brain Injury. It was developed by the Brain Injury Association initially for the TBI waiver providers, in other words, those providing services through the Department of Health TBI waiver. And the initial target kind of group of staff to receive this training was for home and community support staff, HCSS. Again, those most closely providing services to individuals with brain injury under the waiver. It also was designed in a train-the-trainer format. And I'm going to talk a little bit then about the way in which this webinar is going to proceed. I should say that although this was originally designed developed for waiver providers and for home and community support staff, in fact it's been expanded over the years to be relevant for a number of other services. However, you'll hear me talking about, and in the materials that the programs will receive after, there are special highlighted areas for those who are participating as waiver providers. So we have not lost the waiver piece, but the reach of the training is much broader than just the waiver or than only home and community support staff. So this was developed in a train-the-trainer format, and the original idea was that we would present the training to those individuals within provider agencies who had the responsibility for training the staff, and that after those trainers were trained, they would be able to go back to their programs and assure that their staff received the training. The training itself is a core of very important, very useful information, and really has been viewed as a basis of what really a minimum expectation of what staff the information that staff should have. So in the best train the trainer format, I am going to go through the training. There are times when I will make comments for those of you who are involved in providing training in your agencies. Times when I'll make comments or suggestions that if you're doing this training in your agency, pay attention to particular things or be aware of other things so that you have that information. But as I say, in the best train the trainer format, I'm going to go through the training. Now, this is the second time we've presented this in a webinar format, and that really, I think, makes it accessible to many more people. When I have done this in person, we've been able to model some of the icebreakers and some of the other activities that I will mention as we go through this. Now, those of you representing programs will receive, subsequent to this, will receive a jump drive that contains the training materials, and that will be slides. It will be a script to go along with the slides. It will be handouts that you might want to use to go along with the slides, and it will also, or separately, you will have a DVD. The DVD that was developed is an opportunity for individuals with brain injury to talk about what they like, what services they expect, their expectations of service providers, what living with a brain injury is like for them, and really some first-person experiences and sharing. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have that first-person participation. We developed a DVD, and we provide the DVD so that you can use it if that works for your training. If you have an opportunity to have an individual with brain injury speak about his or her experiences living with a brain injury, that would be excellent as well. But it is very, very important to make sure that that personal experience is a key part of the training, particularly towards the beginning of the training, so that people aren't separated from that, but really understand on a very personal level what life with brain injury is like. As I said, the script will have the text and suggestions, also suggested time frames for different parts of the training. Slides are the slides. Again, you can change them or modify them to suit your training. Most of them are the slides you will see as we go through the training today. Handouts are mentioned throughout, and you'll have the hard copies if you want to use them. We also will have included a pre- and post-test questionnaire. We are not doing that part of this today, although through various poll questions we'll be doing that kind of evaluation as we're going through it. Again, very important to try to assess whether people or what people have learned from participation in the training. Now, we are going through this over a 2-hour span straight. When we do this in person, it's usually about 2.5, 3 hours, but it really is divided into 3 or 4 discrete segments, and I will tell you when those breaks are. Again, that's something that's up to each agency to determine based on what your training calendar looks like, your training schedule, your training needs, and the like. But there are discrete pieces, and there are break points that are available or that are clear through the training if you want to break it into 1 hour segments. So that's basically what you're going to be experiencing today. We're going to go through the training as if you were delivering it. So this training will support direct care staff in the work, increase professionalism, promote respect for the work of direct care staff, and ultimately improve the quality of services to individuals with brain injury. We've been delivering this training probably for the past 5 or 6 years around the state. Some of your agencies may have participated in this in the past. Some of you, I know, are new to this, particularly those who are in school settings or who are in agencies that are newly involved with providing services to people with brain injury. The substance of the training really is applicable across all of those lines. I'll make some other comments, or you can ask questions if I am missing something in all of this. So moving on to the first segment is really the icebreakers and introductions. So it's important to get people involved in the training and in understanding why they're together. We find particularly when you have home and community support staff, but also others, that people may be off providing the services in an individual's home or in a classroom, not knowing other people who are involved either in the same agency, the same school, the same area, who are also providing services and supports to people with brain injuries. We also want training to be informal. We want people to relax so that they're paying attention to the substance, so that it's comfortable. And we also understand, again, if people are providing services by themselves, they may not know other people. It's important to try to build some community within your agencies and try to give people an opportunity to get to know others, because in fact those others may be or may become an informal support group, a group to bounce questions off, all of those kinds of things. So in your materials you will receive the instructions on these kinds of icebreakers. Now personally, I'm a person who hates playing games at trainings or at programs, and I always say that frankly. The one I tend to use when I'm in person is the neural connection, and you have the picture of the koosh ball over on the side. Koosh balls are not so easy to find, but recommended for this particular exercise, and I'll describe it very quickly, but you do have step-by-step directions in the materials you'll be getting. The idea is to throw the koosh ball around, have people in a circle. If any of you listening have participated in this, I think you would agree it's really a lot of fun and does make an important lesson. In any event, you have people throw the koosh ball around to each other, trying to create a pattern that you will point out really reflects a pattern that that the brain might make. The brain is, filled with millions of patterns, and so you'll have practice with that. You'll increase the number of koosh balls following the pattern, and then you'll start changing things. You may tell some group of people only to catch with their left hand, or some group of people to put the koosh ball around them before they throw it. And what tends to happen is that people start dropping the koosh ball, missing picking it up, those kinds of things. And then after a while of that, you will make some dramatic statement like, I don't know, everybody wearing glasses, you're now out of the game. And mostly everything comes to a standstill for a little while, and then people try to figure something out. And really the idea is to just give people a quick and dirty way to get into the brain. First, you create a pattern. You have little disruptions, much like some of the less severe brain injuries might happen, that disrupt the pattern. So the brain will go on, but there might be interruptions with the way in which people do things. And then when you have the more dramatic piece, that really indicates some more severe brain injury. And what would happen if you let that go on, and sometimes we do, is that people would create a new pattern, much like the brain tries to do, create some new pattern and all, may not be as elegant, may not get the same result, but try to heal and move on. So it's a way of having a good time, getting people involved with each other, but also doing some very basic information, basic education about brain injury. 20 characteristics of brain injury talks about identifying different hallmarks of brain injury, and really having people explore how they would describe themselves if they were missing a significant part of the way they identify themselves. And the empathy box is filled with all sorts of things like double vision glasses, a pen that shakes that you'll ask people to write with, and the like. And again, here the idea is to simulate as best as we can some different impacts of brain injury so that people understand. To tell you the truth, sometimes I will play music when people are gathering for a training. I'll play music kind of loud, and then when I'm ready to start, I'll start speaking at really regular voice level, not speaking loud to be heard over the loud music, but just at a regular voice level. And it will take time for folks to realize that I'm actually talking. And again, the point of that is that often for people with brain injuries, their world is filled with lots and lots of noise, and it's very hard to focus, very hard to pick up and focus and hear what's being said and all. So these are all the kinds of things that make the training more informal, but also that are educational about our subject, like our subject of brain injury. And here, after all of this, you might want to show the DVD. You might want to have an individual with brain injury talk about his or her injury and experiences, those kinds of things. And really, it's a perfect time to try to make things come alive. This whole time probably takes close to an hour, and you might want to have a break here for people to just get up, move around, or chit-chat, or whatever they may want to do. So then you can move on to really one of the core pieces, which is education about the brain. Excuse me. I need to get a drink of water. And we think it's important, and this was designed to give basic information, not only about the impact of brain injury, but about the brain and about the mechanism of brain injury. Because again, the more that people, that staff understand what we're talking about, what this world is about, the better able to understand and provide services the staff will be. And so it's very focused on providing education. So we can start here with the brain controlling everything we do, and talking really about the brain as the body's supercomputer. And we, you know, this image is labeled, and you might have in your agencies a model of the brain and what that looks like. We like to do that with the training just because it's a good visual. There's also a tool that's a Jello mold that's brain-shaped, and we can provide information about where to get that. People really like that as well, but the idea is really to have people understand what the brain is. You don't have to get hung up so much on the frontal, occipital, parietal, temporal lobes or brain anatomy as much as understanding that the brain is the body's supercomputer. And that makes it very, very important. Also think it's important to talk about definitions, really to set the stage, because particularly these days there are so many different terms that are thrown around that it's very easy to get confused. And if you are not as steeped in kind of the talk as maybe some of us are, but you're steeped in providing services, but people are still talking to you using all sorts of different terms, it's important to just set the stage and have the baseline. So we suggest starting with the broadest, acquired brain injury, or ABI, and talking a little bit about what that encompasses. Okay, so that, of course, is an injury that's not hereditary, not congenital, not degenerative. And these are some of the examples, certainly not an exhaustive list of the ways in which one can acquire a brain injury. But I think the important piece of this is that acquired brain injury is the broad term. Traumatic brain injury which will be a much more familiar term, I think, for people, is the subset of brain injury. So you can then move on to a discussion about traumatic brain injury, or TBI. And really here, the point is that it's a damage that results from a particular kind of mechanism. So it won't be from a stroke. It won't be from anoxia, from deprivation of oxygen to the brain. It's likely to be from one of these causes. Hitting a windshield or the side of a car or whatever, hitting something stationary, being assaulted, being penetrated, like by a gunshot wound, being shaken, shaken baby, severe whiplash, those kinds of things that can occur. So it's important to really understand the difference. Also, being violently shaken by an external force would now include, or is likely now to include, blast injuries. We're learning a lot about the mechanism of blast injuries as a result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of research currently being done through the Department of Defense and the Veterans Administration to really understand about the proximity to a blast and the injury to a brain when the brain is sent shaking around within the skull. So that is also part of this. A concussion, also a brain injury, so-called mild brain injury. I will be saying so-called when I talk about those, because we say that the measure of mild, moderate, and severe, also terms that people use, really are a medical evaluation at the point of injury. We can talk about a mild brain injury, but it may be anything but mild for the individual who has the injury. So it's very important to remember that. But we now would include concussions as part of this discussion as well, because the concussions frequently occur in the sports context, and of course that's where there's been so much public discussion about heads hitting heads, heads hitting helmets, helmets hitting helmets, and the brain moving around within the skull, hitting the ground, all of those kinds of things. So concussion, brain injury are really the same thing. A concussion is a kind of a brain injury. So that is really kind of the sense of the definitions. So the next question here is which of these would not be classified as a brain injury?
Okay, I'm going to be launching that poll so people can answer. Everyone has about 10 seconds to answer that. Going to give everyone about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close that poll right now and share the results. And it looks like the majority of you answered Alzheimer's disease with 81%, 3% aneurysm, 4% anoxia, 7% traumatic brain injury, and 4% concussion.
So, moving on to the next slide, you see that this is the answer, really, the summary slide, including everything but Alzheimer's, which is really a degenerative disease, although much of the impact, or some of the impact, may mimic some of the impact of brain injury and the like. But again, we do this because part of what your staff will be getting to know is how people sustain their injuries. And so having some information, some understanding of some of these mechanisms of injury becomes very, very important. We think just to understanding, just to knowing how to work with people. So, and again, another kind of summary slide is that acquired brain injury does not include these congenital injuries. It's really critical that staff understand that the individuals with whom they are working sustain their brain injury after some period of time of typical development. Very, very important. They may have sustained their injury after their brain is fully developed as a full-grown adult, living life as a person without a disability. So imagine what the change would be when they sustain a brain injury, impacting their functioning, also impacting their ability to work, family relationships, and the like. They may have sustained the brain injury as a child. The brain is developing, and that will or might follow a different path in terms of working through the brain injury. But it's very, very important, I think, to understand that people in this group, in this community, are people who had some typical development, who had a life before the brain injury. The brain injury occurred, and now there's something different. And we'll talk about why that's so important later on. But it's a theme that comes up over and over again. Just to mention very briefly, you have psychiatric disorders up here. Very often you will see a psychiatric issue living with a brain injury, and it's important, substance abuse and brain injury as well. It's important to try to tease those apart. As it is within the veterans population, we often see brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder living together, and all these things may mimic each other. It's very, very important to try to tease it apart and see if there's a brain injury and try to address the brain injury. Being able to do that may well have an impact on the way in which the other issues are resolved, because it's important to address what deficits might have occurred from the brain injury that might have an impact on the treatment for the psychiatric disability or for a substance abuse or for post-traumatic stress and the like. So it's just important. I think that the take-home message here is it's just really important to try to have as much information about the individual to whom you're providing services or your staff is providing services. Okay, moving on to how brain damage occurs. And again, here the idea is that these are, this is not an opportunity to turn people into neurologists or into experts, but just to give some information for people to have. Because the more information you have, the more you understand, the better the services you'll provide, and frankly, the more respect you have for yourself as a service provider. So here the point really is how complex the brain is, and that everything is interrelated, so that just because an injury might occur in one area of the brain that controls certain functions, other areas of the brain might be implicated as well. And everything is connected. So you can't just have one injury. And it's just important to do that. Now there's a lot, there are several very good teaching tools around this that we can give you some access to. But again, it's not to provide people, not to turn everybody into an expert, as much as really understanding how complex all of this is. Often you'll have the family members or the individual with the brain injury saying, I have a frontal lobe injury. That's interesting information, important information, but may not be the whole story. Or a different kind of injury may not be the whole story. And really that, again, is the point. So how brain damage occurs very quickly. What's described here really, I think, underscores the reason that no two brain injuries are the same. And here you have some of the different factors that may have an impact on the severity of the brain injury or on the recovery after brain injury. The reasons why two people with what looks like the same brain injury may be described as the same injury may not, in fact, have experienced the same injury or the same rate of recovery. And I think that's important, too, because we live in a society where everything is about categorizing. We want to put everything into small boxes. And I think we want to encourage our folks to understand that just because they dealt with Sally or helped provide services to Sally, who sustained a brain injury hitting a windshield in a car crash, and now they're providing services to Jimmy, who sustained a brain injury hitting a windshield in a car crash. Sally's injuries and Jimmy's injuries may not be the same. And so working with Sally may not be the same as working with Jimmy. And it's just important to have staff understand, I think, from the beginning that they can't make those kinds of assumptions, that we really have to approach each person, irrespective of the mechanism of the injury, each person as an individual. Now, you might want to give an example of how brain damage occurs, brain injury occurs in a TBI. If you have the brain model, or even the Jello for that matter, you can use that as a demonstration piece. You can't see me, I'm using my hands as, as I'm doing this also. But again, the point is not to create experts on the mechanism, but just help people understand. And here what you may want to do is just point out or help people understand how this might work. So you may want to talk about a car crash. And again, you will have in the script, you have the more detail that I'm giving you in my narration. You will have what goes along with the slides if you want to use it. So you may want to give the example of a car crash as you go through it. This just gives you different kinds of examples, really, of the different kinds of damage. The immediate hit, what happens when the brain bounces around, and then diffuse kinds of injuries that occur. So on this picture, you kind of have it a little more. You may want to, as I said, use the example of a car crash. So what I usually do is talk about how you're driving in a car. You, of course, have your seatbelt on, as does everybody else in the car. You, of course, are driving the speed limit because we only have law-abiding drivers here. But in any event, you're going along driving and something happens. I was driving and had some black ice this morning. So perhaps you hit black ice, the car goes out of control. The car will keep moving until it hits something stationary that forces it to stop. You, of course, will keep moving until you hit something that forces you to stop. Of course, the seatbelt restraints will be helpful. Airbags, likely to be helpful, or definitely will be helpful, again, depending on the car and what the hit is. But your brain inside your head will keep moving until something stops your head, your skull, and then the brain is going to smash into the inside of your skull. Now, we know that we have hard heads. We know that the skull is really a very good protection for our brain, which, as you know, is the consistency of formed Jello. And so it's soft and pliable. And the inside of the brain, the inside of the skull, excuse me, has bony, projectiles, kind of like thorns, a few suggested to be a vestige of a previous stage of man's evolution. Anyway, your brain will hit the inside of your skull at the point of impact, the focal damage. So there's likely to be some contusion, some damage there. So then you're likely to bounce back. As you know, after you hit something stationary, you tend to bounce back. And your brain will bounce back also. And so you have a second opportunity to have some damage as it moves against the other regions, frontotemporal regions of the brain. And then it will bounce around till it comes back to being settled. Every time the brain moves within the skull is an opportunity for some kind of damage. It may be a shearing of some of the tearing and shearing of the axons within the brain. It may be blood vessels in the lobes of the brain. It really will vary. And again, that underscores the reason why no two brain injuries are alike. No two brains behave in the same way with that kind of circumstance, with that kind of scenario. So it might be interesting for people to really understand what happens in these kinds of injuries. Now, it will vary depending on the kind of injury, obviously. And as I said, there's a lot of research being done now about the blast injuries and then proximity to the blast and changing of the fluids within the head and within the brain and all. So I think the important point for people, and frankly everybody is really quite fascinated by this, is just to understand that it's not just one injury, not one opportunity for an injury, that there are other things that go on that can cause injuries. And then you may want to go on to the next part, which is that other things may occur after that initial injury that may have an effect on the brain. So there may be a hematoma. There may be swelling within the brain. And remember, the skull, the brain has nowhere to go within the skull. And so this might be an individual who had to have part of the skull removed to allow for the brain to swell, increase pressure. There may be seizures, infection, all of those kinds of things. There may be none of these, but there may be some of them, or one of them, or something else, and that may have an impact on the type of injury or the type of damage that may occur. And you may see these over time. It may not be right at the initial point of injury, but may happen hours later, or in some cases maybe days later, and the like. And just some other information. If you have an injury from a medical kind of incident, you might have injuries or damage that tends to be more all over the brain, not just focused primarily in one area. So you see those kinds of the different ways in which that might work. So another question. Most individuals with brain injuries exhibit the same challenges and should be given the same level and type of care. True or false?
Okay, I'm launching that poll right now. I'm going to give everyone about 10 to 15 seconds to answer it. Give everyone about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll right now and share the results. And 97% answered false and 3% answered true.
Okay, well, you guys are very on top of things, and all, which I think is not too much of a surprise. given all of this, but really speaks very importantly about providing some supports for the staff with whom you're working. Now, the very important piece is really the section we go into next, which is every person with a brain injury is different. Okay, and that really builds on everything that we've done up to now. Oh, excuse me. Oh, my goodness, I apologize. We know that each injury is different, and each person was different prior to the injury. And again, it's important to reinforce that because we like to put people in boxes. We like to say, oh, yes, as I said, with Sally, we work with Sally, so now we have Jimmy, and it's exactly the same. When we know it's not the same, and the ability to provide some good, the quality services and make those connections become very, very different when we understand what that we're dealing with a different person, we're supporting a different person as we go. In addition, it's important for staff to understand that every person adjusts differently to the changes that result from a brain injury. So we start out different. We experience our brain injuries in a highly individual way, and we adjust differently to changes that result from brain injury. All of that has an impact on delivering services. And all of that means that the staff that you have supporting people with brain injuries really need to be able to use their judgment and have support from you and your agencies in being able to do that and adjusting to the changes. So now we go into the part of the training that begins to look at the results of brain injury and really may be getting to the heart of the kinds of services that your staff will be providing to the people in your program. Now, I'm always reluctant to do this because we do say and we do understand that every brain injury is unique. And every person is unique, and the way they move forward is unique. And yet, we have to try to categorize the kinds of impacts you may see. And so these are incredibly broad functional areas. We'll go through each one. I will tell you in advance that you may see nothing that we talk about. That does not mean that the individual has not sustained a brain injury. You may see some things from one of these categories, but not from others, from all of them. It really is the epitome of individual here. And in some ways, I was trying to think of how to describe it. And I'm sure that there are ways for it with all the new technology with like drop-down menus and the like. But what kept coming back to me is I remember when I was in school 1,000 years ago, the worst kinds of multiple choice tests we used to get were those that gave a fact pattern, and then your choices at the end were the best answer is A and B but not C, D and F and sometimes A, all of the above, none of the above, and, you know, all of those permutations. And that's very much what this is. You may see some of these things. You may see none of them. You may see all of them. It's really all over. Now, for those of you who are service coordinators, that becomes a very, you know, interpreting the information you have and understanding the needs of the individual are very much related to really teasing out what the impact of the injury is, what the individual needs. And for the staff that are providing more direct services or providing independent living skills training or community reentry, some of those other kinds of services and supports, or return to school after sustaining a brain injury from sports or from a car crash or from any other way. It's really important to try to understand this. And the other piece of it, before we start going through it, is to understand that moving on from a brain injury, recovering in the way that looks from a brain injury, is also not a linear process. Unlike a broken bone, or perhaps a recovery even from open heart surgery where there are particular benchmarks, there may be benchmarks, but they will look very different and they will change over time. So sometimes that really can frustrate or confound a service provider, a teacher, a nurse, healthcare provider of a variety of disciplines and the like. And so I just say to try to step back and understand who this person is, whether it be a child or whether it be an adult, and try to kind of move back from your own sense of things or where people should be, and understand that it doesn't necessarily progress in a linear fashion. The other kind of beginning comment before we go through this is also understand, for those of you who work with children in a school or other setting, or if you're family members and have a child who sustained a brain injury, we know now from the research that the brain is not fully developed until into our early 20s. And so you may not see a particular problem at the time of an injury when a child is injured. It may show up years later when the part of the brain that was injured is called upon to function. So again, I can just caution you and the people with whom you work or you might be training to understand that just because you see something new, if you see something new, to try to relate it back to the brain injury. It may not be related, but it may be, and that brain injury may explain what it is that you're seeing. So I'll mention a number of these things as we go through this, but just to start, and I'm starting with physical. And again, what you have here is some of the most common physical problems that people experience after brain injury. By no means an exhaustive list. Now, I'm not going to go through them individually. I just want to highlight a few of them and maybe ask you, if you're providing services, maybe ask you to ask yourself what impact this problem might have on the way in which services are being provided. So when we talk about fatigue, for example, a person with a brain injury, and also when we talk about, I should talk about fatigue, sleep disturbances, we are talking not about I'm tired because I don't sleep. We're talking about things like a disruption of the sleep-wake cycle. We're talking about that bone-numbing fatigue where you simply cannot move. And so I would ask you, I know how I function, or the problems I have functioning when I'm tired, when I don't have a good night's sleep. Imagine if your sleep-wake cycle is disturbed, if you have fatigue that may be related to that disruption in the sleep-wake cycle, but also maybe related to the meds that the individual may now be taking, or the exhaustion of trying to get through the most, what might be characterized as simple kinds of functions. Our service delivery tends to be organized on a regular workday, 8 to 5, 9 to 5, 8 to 4, those kinds of things. Well, if your sleep-wake cycle is disrupted. And so you're awake in the middle of the night, you're asleep or ready to be sleeping at 8 in the morning. Does it make sense to schedule therapies at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning or 10 in the morning? Do we need to look at reworking that so that the individual can be getting the services at a time when he or she is likely to be able to follow them, likely to have success in learning skills? And if you're working with home and community support staff, these are individuals who are working most closely with the individual with the brain injury. They will be observing and understanding things that become, I think, very, very important for the clinical team to have feedback about, for the service coordinator to have feedback about. And you want to empower your home and community support staff to make sure that they share that information so that it's not lost, so that it could be captured, so that it could be responded to, those kinds of things. Also, let me mention the loss of smell and taste. Now, I have to be honest, when I first was thinking about that, I was thinking in many ways, well, what's the big deal? And frankly, maybe it's better to not have such a good sense of smell, except that our senses of smell and taste are very often how we relate to critical parts of our lives, how we relate around food, how we relate around an environment, all of those kinds of things. And so losing those two senses can really have an impact on the way an individual engages with his or her world and all. Dysarthria, by the way, is a speech-language issue, frequently showing up as slurred speech, often described as sounding similar to a person who is drunk. So again, imagine the difficulty in communication, the difficulty with speech, and because the world around this individual may not know that he or she sustained a brain injury, the leaping to a conclusion that, oh, that person's drunk. And well, what kind of impact can that have on the individual and on moving forward? Headaches I also want to mention because here we frequently are talking about headaches that are unrelenting, and that can be as severe as migraines, unrelenting. So I'm sure we all get headaches. I do get migraines. They can be totally debilitating for some period of time, but not forever. But imagine if that was your everyday, what that would do to your ability to interact with the world, to learn new skills, to your personality, all of those kinds of things. So I give you this list just to say, think about these things. You may not see any of them. You may see all of them. You may see some of them. But think about the impact on your life and on the life of the individual who has sustained the injury when one or some of these problems occur, and on the impact on the provision of services to that individual. So now we move on to the cognitive. And the cognitive, in many ways, are viewed as the hallmark of a brain injury. And so I'll spend a little time talking about these. Tend to be, you know, again, depending on where the brain is injured and how severe and the individual and all. I think that the hallmark of the cognitive issues after brain injury is the interference with short-term working memory. So let's talk about that for a little while. And let's think about how many of us in the brain injury world have, in talking to, supporting, working with an individual with brain injury, or in our families, among our friends, have said, "Don't you remember?" And the person will say no, might say no, and you repeat something, and then you repeat it, and then you say, "Don't you remember?" The truth is that that individual may have lost or severely diminished the ability of that individual to remember. It's not that they're being oppositional or obnoxious or not paying attention. It's that that function no longer works. And so that's very challenging. No more challenging. It's the most challenging for the individual with the brain injury. I'm sure that as frustrated as a staff person might get, or as we might get in conversation, nobody is as frustrated as the individual. And I think that that's very important to remember. It does tell us that we really have to pay attention to the way in which we provide services and developing working compensatory strategies to support that individual in being able to learn information. Frequently people talk about Post-its or sticky notes, I guess I should call them, as a way of helping individuals get cues and remember or try to remember where they need to be, what order they're supposed to do things, and those kinds of things. My niece had sustained a brain injury some years ago in a workplace problem where she worked in a restaurant and a piece of heavy kitchen equipment was not put back correctly and fell off a shelf and hit her in the head. And she experienced headaches and some interference with her short-term memory. And she said that the sticky notes all over her living space at that point were incredibly helpful in just keeping her able to function in an orderly fashion to get things done. So it's really looking at what some of the strategies are to support that individual. In the domestic violence setting, just for another example, I don't know if anybody on the phone is on the webinar, is working with people with domestic violence, but one of the main focuses in a domestic violence setting is safety planning. And one of the, I won't say rules, but common practices is not to write anything down. Well, if you have a victim of domestic violence who's sustained a brain injury, who has interference with short-term memory, you have to develop some other ways of supporting that individual in that safety planning and balancing it that way. So those are just some of the ways that we begin to take this general information and incorporate it in the way we work. Similarly, if you're working with students, there's other ways to, and strategies to keep the student focused on the task at hand. And as you see from the other items on the slide, all of these are cognitive related, very, very important to our ability to move forward and to function, to hold a job, to have a conversation, to interact with other people in our families, in our communities, those kinds of things. Attention, chop things into small periods. You may not be wanting to provide services, or it may not make sense to provide services in a 1-hour block. Maybe you need smaller blocks. Look at the space. Are we in cubicles where there's a lot going on, or are we in a quiet place where you can actually just be focused, you, the staff or the service provider, with the individual with the brain injury, teacher with the student, those kinds of things. We may have the issue where you have the person who is functioning at a very high level work is now not able to perform the same tasks, or that a person who could do well with abstract thinking, and these are functions that we develop over time, and abstract conceptualization gets lost in all of that mush and really needs to be much more concrete and needs to understand things in a much more concrete way. And the like. Please understand, we're not talking about people, and I'm using crude terms here that I've heard people use, and I hope it's nobody here, but you know, people who are smart become stupid. Well, no, it's stupid. I don't even know what that means, frankly, but that's not a term we're talking about at all. We're talking about people whose previous abilities were interfered with now. And our focus is how to support those individuals in recapturing as much as they can of those previous abilities. They may need help in problem solving. They may need help in getting started on doing something and the like. So all of that, you may see some, you may see none. But the cognitive, again, the hallmark. Closely related, again, to executive functioning, a frontal lobe set of skills. And here we're talking about another very important set of skills, and you could put that together with the cognitive that we just spoke about and understand. And perhaps some of you are seeing individuals you know or you're working with who are in some of these areas, who show some of these problems. It may be that the individual can no longer get started or figure out how to go from step A to step B to step C to step D in a linear fashion. That for them, they may be going from A to D to F to E, you know, back and forth all over. And so the support is in helping them figure out what the steps are and then moving forward to it. They may be able to tell you how to do something, but may not be able to organize themselves to actually do it or to complete a task coming to fruition. They may have a problem with decision making and the like. You may say to somebody who wants to be independent or who is independent, can you travel by yourself? And the person might say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Except that they may get very confused when they actually set out to do that. I have a friend of the family who was a truck driver, sustained a brain injury, went back to driving the truck. Of course, now with the GPS, it's a little easier, not totally, but before the GPS, or before he had a GPS, can you go back to being a truck driver? Oh, yeah, no problem. And so he started out, except he would get lost because what was familiar to him was not familiar, or was not familiar in a way that helped him be able to get from point A to point B. And the like. So again, these are challenges for which there are supports and for which there are strategies. It's just important to understand that, that they exist and the way in which we want to support that individual for any kind of services that the individual is receiving. The fourth area is the affective behavioral cluster of behaviors. And again, some of these are the kinds of behaviors that people frequently identify with brain injury. Excuse me. It's hard to speak to my computer without having some drinks of water along the way. So here maybe we can talk a little bit or identify about impulsivity. And again, people identify this often. There's an individual who might blurt things out in the middle of a group. That can be very disruptive to a group, and depending on what the group is doing, that really can undermine some of the conversation, some of the work. So again, this is something to pay attention to. People may become very irritable, very short-tempered, very, very frustrated, and become impulsive and lash out. They become very depressed. You hear depression a lot, which you can understand when you have an individual who really has had a profound loss. They've lost the individual that they were before. And depending on how severe the injury, their sense of self, it may be fundamentally shaken and all. And that certainly would be depressing and difficult. And so you may see that. You may see the lashing out, as I said. You may see the lack of ability to understand the external cues. So the person may have no idea that they're maybe crossing the border of what we in our culture consider personal space, or that they're behaving in a way or asking questions that are not the kinds of things that we consider to be kind of fair game, I guess, as it were. And then you may have a person, this is very common in the movies, but more in the movies than in real life, where you have that person, I think it was regarding Henry, that movie where Harrison Ford was just a perfectly dreadful individual, and then he sustained an injury, and then he became very altruistic and quite wonderful. I don't know that we're talking about personality changes that are so dramatic, but you really may have the person who was the life of the party who's now very withdrawn, or the person who was very withdrawn who now is living larger than life. And all, and again, that may change over time, but it's really understanding the relationship of that change to the brain injury that becomes important. The judgment also may be very, very important and something to watch. You may have individuals who think that their judgment is totally not unchanged. And it may turn out that that's really not necessarily the case. They just don't necessarily see it. It has an impact a lot for home and community support staff, but also for independent living skills training. I'm thinking about some of the issues around cooking, around kitchen safety that really combine with maybe some of the cognitive issues. Turn on the stove to boil water or to do something else and forget and just walk away. Those are health and safety issues that become very important to pay attention to. And since I know some of you are family members, and perhaps your family member with a brain injury is not receiving any of these kinds of services from an agency, that you're the person who is supporting your family member, these should be ringing true, or might be ringing true for you in the kinds of things that you're looking at. And in the handouts and in the script, you'll have an instruction about this. And in the handouts, you have information that suggests different kinds of strategies for addressing some of these and the other issues that we've discussed and all. And those will be very, very important to share with staff, to share with other family members, to understand. And for those of you with brain injury who are participating in this training, the feedback I've gotten over the years from people with brain injuries who have participated is also that they find this enormously helpful to share with the folks who are providing services for them. So hopefully you will agree with that, and that this is helpful as you are in the position of educating those around you about living with a brain injury. So for the last kind of, again, general category here, look at the psychosocial. And here, again, you have a constellation of different kinds of things. Excuse me, the educational, vocational issues may be, oh my goodness, excuse me, that the individual is not able to go back to work at the level that he or she was at before. I've had, and you know, again, it's not limited to a particular kind of occupation. I gave you the example of the young friend who was a truck driver, who could not go right back to that for a variety of reasons, and actually moved on to a different kind of work. It may be the person who can't go back to school or can't go back with a full course load, or can't go back to honors classes at this moment. It may be the person who was a nurse who can't go back to nursing in a hospital, but who could provide nursing skills and supports in a different context, in a different kind of setting, and the like. So it's really here a cluster of putting things together. It's not one issue. It's a number of things that you might see. So, you know, those are the kinds of things in the educational vocational problems. For the families, I think it's really, really important to remember that brain injuries happen to a family, not just to an individual, although obviously it happens to the individual 100%. But imagine, again, depending on where that individual is in the context of the family, it may just turn everything on its head. If it's the person who's the primary breadwinner who sustains the injury and can't go back to work, imagine what that does to a family dynamic. If the injured individual is the parent who's used to taking care of kids, now the kids have to take care of the parent, that's a different kind of relationship. It really has an impact on the whole fabric of the family. If it's a parent who may have some other issues, can't go to the games that they used to go to, can't help with homework, that kind of thing, imagine the change in relationship between the parent and the child, and the like. So this is very, very complex, very, very important to try to understand. Even if you're not providing family supports, understand that the family is in a crisis as well, and that the family dynamic has been changed as well, and really needs to be supported. And the bottom whole part, or the whole cluster there on the interpersonal and intrapersonal, I'm reminded of a book that Christopher Reeves wrote after he sustained his very devastating spinal cord injury. And that book was titled Still Me, Still Me. So his point, of course, was that, yes, I've been seriously injured. Yes, I cannot do what I was doing. I cannot be this movie star. I can't be Superman, but I'm still me. And so it's the struggle, because there's so much loss, as I mentioned earlier, so much loss of the sense of self, of defines who you are, defining who you are in the family, who you are in work and school. So much of that is lost or is disrupted, that you really have both the profound sense of loss and a shaken sense of self. And so it's important to remember this still me. Who am I? I am still me. I am still this person. And it's the struggle to get back to that. But you can imagine what that does for a person in sense of self, and for a person going forward in working through the very, very difficult issues of dealing with the challenges from a brain injury. And so that will have an impact for HCSS, for home and community support staff, for any kind of supports for the individual that are being offered. So now we have another poll question, which you'll see on the screen. A common result of brain injury is loss of long-term memory. Individuals cannot remember who they used to be.
Okay, I'm launching that poll right now. Give everyone a few seconds to answer that. Going to give everyone about 5 more seconds. All right, I'm going to be closing that poll and sharing the results. And it looks like 80% answered false and 20% answered true.
Okay. Oops, lost where I was. Okay, so result of brain injury. I realize that we have a lot more to do and I don't have a lot of time, so I will, but some of these will go faster, so I apologize if I've been speaking too fast. I feel like I've been going very fast. So we talked about this. They're not just lists of problems that may occur, and so you see yes or no on the long-term memory is often they can remember who they were, right? And it's a different person. But that may or may not be the case depending on an individual. I have not used deficits. I put it here in quotes because I tend to think of these things as challenges, but in different parts of our healthcare field, you hear them as deficits. So I encourage more value-neutral language, but we have that there in any event. And finally, and these are some of the summary slides that would really lead to a break in doing the training. Remembering that we're talking out with people who started out with brain function intact and then damaged. It's really important to remember that the people with whom you'll be working, with whom your staff is supporting, may have many intact abilities. So this is any of us with some interference in the functioning, and that I think becomes very important. And this is a summary. And again, I'm giving you all the slides not for this presentation as much as for what you might use when you're doing the training for your staff. Like a lot of summary about the different pieces. Now, you may choose to take a break here or kind of after the next little section of this. So now we're getting down to some more concrete things, really how you work with a person with a brain injury. And we came up with this little thing called ROAD. Read, review, observe, ask questions, don't assume, and all to help supporting the individual, okay? And you don't really want to make sure that your staff understand that they don't want to do for people what the people can do for themselves. But it's hard to figure that out, and that's part of the work, part of the function that they do. So the first, read, review. You want to encourage people to read what they're given. You want to make sure they have service plans and read them, and that they're written to provide information. A good service plan will provide a lot of the background information and the supports. So to the extent that that the staff, and again, this will depend based on the staff that you're training and the staff you're working with, to the extent that they can get information and that they can understand it, that will be really important. And hopefully some of the reports are not written in such technical, medical, or neuropsychological information that it is accessible for staff. But the information can really be kind of an alert for staff members, particularly home and community support staff, who's direct care staff, who spend so much time with an individual. It's really important to get any alerts. And also for them to bring information back, I said this earlier, to the team, to the clinical team. That is very, very important to have that feedback loop. It also may give the staff member some information about the individual's strengths and all, and we know that that's important. With regard to observe, we're talking about active observation. What works, what doesn't work, when does it work? Does an activity, for example, banking, does that work better at 2:30 or does that work better at 9:30 in the morning? When will the person be at their best? And observing that. What environment supports that person being successful? And observing that and sharing that with other members of the team. And remembering that really is a team support approach that will lead to the most success. Encouraging people, encouraging staff to ask questions. Now, this is something a lot of staff doesn't necessarily feel comfortable asking questions or talking, but it becomes very important to be very clear about what's going on. So I would suggest encouraging staff to ask questions of the individual, ask questions of those around them, of others on the team, and to ask questions of the supervisor. Now, as a supervisor, for those of you in that position, I would think you'd want to know beforehand if the staff person is seeing something that they have questions about or that they're concerned about. Because if they don't ask questions and things go along, you know, bad stuff might happen. And you want to avoid that. You want to learn information when you have an opportunity to intervene and to support the individual and the staff. You don't want to wait until you have a crisis before you become involved. So you really want to encourage people. They might want to ask of the individual they're supporting, when do you feel the best? When do you feel most awake? When do you feel certain kinds of things? How do you think this would work best? And to try different kinds of things just to get a sense of that. Because remember, you always want to build on the strengths and go from there and that's a dynamic process. And as a staff person develops a relationship with the individual they're supporting, and hopefully a family or friends around that individual, you really develop a community around trying to provide successful or opportunities for success for that individual. And finally, on this little kind of road and all, you want to encourage people not to assume. You don't want to underestimate at all, and you don't, our next slide will be not overestimating. You really do want to build on those strengths and promote those strengths and promote the independence. But on the other hand, you don't want to overestimate. And here the slide talks specifically on the waiver, but this will be true for anybody with a brain injury. And so I always caution service providers in any environment to understand that what might look like willful behavior may be related to the brain injury. So again, if a person doesn't show up for doctor's appointments, let's say, over and over again, the doctor's office may decide, oh, well, they're not interested, or they're just, you know, can't follow direction or whatever, and be furious and cross them off, when in fact it may be that the person can't do it because of the brain injury. And so the question should be, how can we support this person in being able to come regularly to the doctor's office, for example. Same thing with medications. Don't follow medication. And now, honestly, with technology and smartphones and all of the apps that are available now, there are all sorts of tools that are available to help address some of the challenges as a result of brain injury. But it really is the encouragement for staff, for families, friends, individuals to step back from a behavior before you quickly label it and dismiss it or characterize that person in a negative way, to really step back and say to yourself, what is it that I'm seeing? And encourage your staff to say, what is it that I'm seeing? What is being exhibited here? Is this just a person who doesn't care, or is this a person who has lost the ability to do this particular function? And how can I support that? And also, that becomes very, very important, I think, particularly because when you're in the thick of things, it's easy to just lose track of where you are and all. And also to encourage for each of us and our staffs to understand who and what we are and what we bring to the table. And to also understand the individual beyond the brain injury. And that's why I'll talk about it in a second, why we talk about people first language. We talk about individuals with brain injury, not brain injured individuals. It is a person. I am a person first. And then I have other characteristics or other traits or other things that help have an impact on who I am. But I am an individual first. And I think that that is just very important for staff to remember. So these are just some summaries, things to remember as people work with individuals with brain injuries. Because remember, we're doing this as a training. You should be hearing yourself providing this to the people with whom you work. And so you want to encourage people to just remember some of these things, and also to try not to take things personally. My former colleague, Dr. Marie Cavallo, always used to point out that she had a person in one of the programs that she was involved with, who always used to say to her, "Hey, Dr. Cavallo, you're looking very fat today." Well, nobody would like to be told that, and she didn't either. And, she always said that it took her a while to get to the point where she realized actually the person wasn't, being critical necessarily, and she shouldn't take it personally. It just is something. It's not meant personally. It's not meant mean-spiritedly. It was the way the person was just doing some chit-chatting. And informal talking with her. So it's important, because in the course of working with anybody during any period of time, people say things that they think are funny. They don't mean to be hurtful, but actually they can be hurtful. So we want to encourage people not to take them personally. These are some other kinds of things that we really have talked about. Cultural and personal values are very, very important to recognize. Again, we used to give the example of an individual receiving services who wanted to learn to cook, a person of Hispanic origin who wanted to learn to cook. And so the staff thought, oh, that's great, and went and got particular foods. That staff person was from one Latin country, and went and got foods from their country. And then the individual receiving the services was just furious about it, because from that person's country, the major food was something different. And so, again, we need to understand the cultural and personal values and respect the differences, and know that not everybody is the same, and work with that. But finally, I think it's really important for you to emphasize for your folks that you know that this is hard. This is really hard work. This is hard, and progress may be slow, but it's important to keep at it. You also want to remind people to seek supervision and support from supervisors. And again, those of you who are supervisors, I'm sure would much rather know about things in advance than about things after they've happened or when they've become a crisis, and it becomes much more difficult to address it than then. And this is a long period of time and of training, and you will have a lot of discussion around some of these, or you can, and the script has areas where it poses questions or suggests questions you might want to pose for your group to generate some conversation. But everywhere along the way on the topics we just discussed, you will have staff who will be thinking of people with whom they've worked or people they know who show some of these challenges, or people with whom they've worked where they've had some success or some frustration, all of those kinds of things. What you really want to do, and I think it goes back to something I said at the beginning about creating an informal and a safe environment for staff to talk, is you really want to encourage people to share successes, problems, challenges, things they're unsure of, all of that in a safe way. That's the way to build the confidence, the good services, the professionalism of your staff, which certainly has an impact on the quality of the services. So that is very important, and it brings you to this. So if you have not taken a break by this time in doing your training, this would be a good time to take one. This is a lot of material to cover. As I said, the jump drive that you'll get has handouts that you might want to use to reinforce some of these things. Really try to encourage as much discussion as you can around these, even if it means that you have to schedule a little more training time, because this is just fundamental to developing quality services for people. So now we have another poll question. Individuals with brain injuries want to be treated in a way that recognizes their ability as well as their disability.
Okay, I'm launching that poll now. Give everyone a few seconds to answer that. All right, going to give about 5 more seconds. And I'm closing the poll now, and I'm going to share those results. Looks like 97% of people answered true, and 3% answered false.
Okay. Okay. So now we move on to a whole new section that, unfortunately, given time, this is what always happens. I spend so much time in the other. So here I will move a little more quickly around a set of slides. It's actually got two pieces to it. And the first has to do with communicating with people with disabilities. And we were encouraged to put this in, or asked to put this in, both by participants in the initial survey, individuals with brain injuries, and also by providers and others with whom we spoke in putting this together. We did, by the way, years ago, when it was initially developed, did do some pilot testing, made adjustments accordingly. This was one of the sections because we were told that it's very important that staff be comfortable working with individuals with disabilities. And despite a lot of progress in recognizing disabilities in our country, we still have a lot of people who have some level of discomfort in talking to people with disabilities. And when you look at the DVD that we developed that comes with this, you do have some reference to treating adults like adults and not talking to people as if they are babies or don't understand just because they have a brain injury. But the most important piece on this is to use people first language. I referenced that earlier. by saying that it's very, very important that we remember that we're talking about people. So that's why we always use individuals with brain injury, for example, in our language. And just remember that we're talking about people first. Very, very important. And to speak directly to the individual, we'll frequently see people, when the individual with the brain injury is there, talking to a family member who's there, or ignoring the fact that an individual is there. And, you know, these are just common sense in some ways, but very difficult, very important, I'm sorry, to make sure that people understand and to relax about it. Sometimes people get so nervous and so uptight that it's just a little bizarre in the way some people act. So just to relax and do this. This is important because some of the people on your staffs may not have much experience or any experience working with people with disabilities. So it's important to spend some time about this. This slide also we put in because, and again, this is important as conversation. You have material in the script that addresses or suggests some ways of talking about this. These are questions, actual questions that people have asked us when we posed a more general question about how people interact with people who look and act differently. And so these are areas of discomfort that some people have and are important for you as a service provider to make sure your staff are comfortable with and can answer. And finally, this is a continuation of this. And it really is, they really do come from a place of wanting to be supportive of people, but also feeling uncomfortable and not quite knowing how to proceed. So we put these here as questions for you to work with your staff about. On this slide, you have in the materials, or you will have, this booklet that came from the state health department, developed a number of years ago, really quite excellent, about people first and about communication and about balancing between encouraging independence, protecting individuals, all of those kinds of things. It's a very good piece, very helpful piece, and one that you might want to incorporate, and it will be in the handouts. The last piece, I know I'm moving along very quickly here for me too. The last piece of the training, and you may want to do this separately as well, for those of you who are providing services under the DOH waiver, this was a part of the training that used to be specific to participants' rights. It has been revised and made more general, but it does ring still with participants' rights. And in the script that you get with the slides, you have very specific pieces here that are linked to the DOH waiver. But when one steps away from the waiver and looks generally at these topics, I think everybody would agree that they have meaning and are important to providing quality services, irrespective of whether an individual is receiving services on the waiver or not. So the first cluster we put together is a cluster that we call personal dignity. I should say also that these should lead to substantial discussion among your staff. And if staff is slow at starting, you should start, because it's very, very important that people really explore these. These may be areas that don't have right or wrong answers, that are not so concrete. So what you want to promote, again, in your staff is the confidence and the ability to use sound personal judgment around some of what they're doing. For example, offer, not impose. You want to respect somebody's personal dignity by offering help, offering to do something, but you don't want your staff person to control the decision, to make a decision and force the individual to follow that decision. And that's a fine line. That's very, very difficult. And so you may want to use this as an opportunity to discuss various scenarios. And again, some are suggested in the script. This is essential to rebuilding a sense of self-confidence and the like. You may, repeating questions over and over again, may not be helpful for a person. Repeating instructions, I should say, more than once will become important. Not saying don't you remember, or expecting a person to remember, or forcing a person to ask the staff person to repeat. You may just want to repeat things on a regular basis for an individual who has a short-term memory loss, for example. It's really becomes important. And again, as you're doing this with your staff, you can try to apply these and the others we'll be discussing to their everyday experience. You want to ask people to give examples of how to offer to help, or how to offer solutions, how to test things, which we'll talk about, and the like. And so that becomes important from the personal dignity. We always want to be supporting an individual's personal dignity and sense of self. Next, the cluster around privacy. This is so, so, so important for people who provide services in a person's home. You're coming into their home. That's their home turf. They are free to have their furniture arranged however they want. They're free to have relationships, although there is some discussion about different kinds of relationships and about how you balance privacy versus potential harm. It's very difficult. You might have hovering family members also that might interfere with the person's sense of privacy and the like. So this is very, very important. But I think if we remember, staff, that you have somebody in somebody else's home, that really will lead to, I think, some good exercising of judgment. But here we're also balancing the right to privacy versus a staff person's job in preventing or reducing the likelihood of potential harm. And all. We had an example that was given to us when we pilot tested this training of an individual with a brain injury who wanted to travel independently. But his family kept saying, no, he can't do it, he'll get lost. And the staff member actually came up with a way of shadowing the individual to test that, to see if that individual could travel independently. In fact, what turned out was that the individual could, and the staff person had trouble and got lost. So there's always things to learn in working with people, particularly if you have an open mind in approaching it, and don't come from a place of one person's right and one person is wrong. The next cluster is under personal choices. And here again we have this balance between assisting somebody and increasing independence. You don't want the staff person to do something that an individual can do for him or herself. And the pull is between autonomy and protection and the like. Suppose a person doesn't want to participate in a day program that they're supposed to. Well, you can't force somebody to do that. The staff person shouldn't be, but perhaps there's a discussion that can occur around that and test something else out. Maybe that is a good decision for that individual, and maybe he or she will come to that on their own. And the next cluster is self-identification of goals and desires. And here, direct staff have a unique position to encourage positive growth, encourage participants to increase the challenge and all, and to understand that there's nothing bad about failing. You have to risk something and push yourself in order to succeed and move. So you balance against unrealistic sense of capacity, encourage risk, but support that in a way that really builds on growth and on pushing limits. Next is the freedom from abuse. Really important, big discussion area. Every agency should have policies and backup for staff. Really important that staff really understand this, and that there be emergency policies in place that staff have access to and that staff understand. This is just not easy at all, but that there's zero tolerance. Any kind of physical abuse or emotional abuse is unacceptable. And, you know, that's kind of one of the absolutes in all of this. But there will be a lot of discussion, as well there should be, in working here. Some forms of abuse are harder to define than others, verbal, psychological, those kinds of things. As I say, agency policies, emergency backups are very, very important. And the last cluster is freedom from isolation. We know and we hear that individuals with brain injuries are frequently experience incredible isolation. They may be home by themselves. Friends kind of drift away. Family may drift away. It's very, very important for individuals to be out and have interactions and build a lifestyle. Perhaps it may be religious. Perhaps it may be community. It's going to the movies. It's those kinds of things, and they're very, very important. And as staff members, you want to be encouraging people to seek those kinds of interactions, those kinds of opportunities, because the isolation can just be incredibly detrimental to a sense of rebuilding self and moving forward. And your staff is really, in, again, a very important, very good position to try to promote that. So, and that whole section, that discussion about those clusters of things are really discussion in themselves. There's a lot to talk about there. I've gone through it fast here. In your training, though, you'll give some of the examples, and you really will invite people, I hope, to provide their own experiences and to share them and to share the way they responded to some things. Lord knows I've heard some harrowing responses, but also some incredibly innovative and interesting and wonderful ways in which staff have moved forward supporting individuals. And at the end of the day, that's where you want to be. You want to be supporting the notion of a partnership between your staff and the individual, a partnership among the staff, the individual, and perhaps his or her family or others around him or her, and a sense of a whole in your agency where your staff feel valued and part of a very, very important work. So this is some information about the Brain Injury Association of New York State for those of you who perhaps are not so familiar with our organization. These are some of the materials that are available for download on our website. The 5-year plan issued by the New York State Health Department in 2002 very interesting information about ways of moving forward, perhaps that the state has put out there as an action plan. The waiver program brochure is what it sounds like. A description of the waiver, again, available for folks. These are some other resources available. These are in particular around concussion and for children with brain injuries. This is our contact information. And thank you. Here's our Be Our Friend. Like us on Facebook, sign up for our email, follow us on Twitter. Upcoming events, our annual conference will be in 2014, June 5th and 6th at the Marriott Hotel. There will be information available at the website. Look for it soon. We also will be offering a symposium entitled Latest Developments in Brain Injury Identification, Rehabilitation, and Treatment, featuring really a very well-known faculty talking about the latest developments, as it says, and that's on June 5th, also at the Marriott Hotel. And also a very busy day. We'll be offering once again the training and testing for the brain injury specialist certification, which is becoming a very important, well-known certification for staff people who work directly with individuals with brain injuries. More information about that program generally is available on our website. About the June 5th program will be available as well. So